Senator Banks, yeah, we have a great big map up here that we're going to talk all about here in a second. But thank you for taking the time to do this with us here. I want to point out, too, that Senator Banks is the first we've been doing this event series for a little over a year now, the first person that we've had back. So that's a distinguished honor for the great senator from Indiana. So we did our big event with him last summer, and he was with us for that. So, Senator, the big topic du jour today is obviously the threat of China. We saw the president announce yesterday he has rescheduled his visit. He is going to meet with Xi Jinping in mid-May. What are some of the things you're looking for when President Trump goes to meet with Xi in May?
Well, good to be with all of you. First of all, President Trump is the first president of our lifetime that's taken the China threat seriously. I remember on the campaign trail in 2016, just to go back in history a little bit, the primary between Cruz and Trump came down to Indiana. And Matt, you know this, Indiana is the top manufacturing state in the country. My dad is a retired union factory worker. And when Donald Trump came to Indiana and campaigned on the campaign trail to Hoosiers, he talked about China is our biggest enemy. He's the biggest threat to our jobs, to the American-made economy. And my dad had never heard a politician talk like that before, except for Ross. My dad had the Ross Perot sticker on the pickup truck when I was a little kid. And he didn't get excited about another candidate until Trump. So Trump carried through the agenda in the first term of the first time that we had a president that didn't call China our friend, but called them our enemy and our threat. We rewrote the national security strategy to reorient our military priorities around China and made up a lot of ground and made up for a lot of mistakes that previous presidents, Republican and Democrat, had made to strengthen China's hand over the United States. So Trump was the first president of either party who took this seriously. And a lot was done on the military end in the first term, before all the goofy stuff happened on Russian collusion and impeachments and all that stuff that sidelined President Trump. Now re-enter President Trump in the second term, and Matt, it's been all about tariffs. And President Trump figured out the military part of it, and the second term is all about the economic, the tariff picture, and reorienting global trade around the world to put American interest ahead of China, and quickly got China's attention. I mean, the fact that he's going to meet with Chairman Xi and to talk about America First priorities, he has their attention. He has leverage over them that he's willing to use to stand up to them and put our interests first. So I have a lot of thoughts about what that will look like. If it were any, let me finish by saying this: if it were any other president, I wouldn't feel good about the president of the United States going to Beijing and meeting with their leader. But it's President Trump. He's the toughest president that we've ever had, and he's going to put our interests first, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of it.
It really does feel like there's an American worker's voice in the room, right? That's the whole reason why I think the working class people that you're talking about were excited about Trump coming back to the White House. Trump coming to the White House in the first place and then coming back is because they wanted a seat at the table here as these things are being decided. So the big map that we have over here is the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And I know it's a little small for some of the folks in the audience, and I know that we're going to make sure we have that graphic up on the website. But what we've seen the Chinese do for the last 30, 40 years, they've been engaged in a major, whole-of-nation strategy to try to advance. And by the way, kudos to them. They're advancing their national interests around the world. But they are doing things through debt diplomacy, through various trade deals, through it's all about geopolitical control, and it's about, we've got friends in the room here from Greece and Taiwan, and other nations around the world too. But the fact is that what the Chinese have been doing is they've been on an aggressive tear for the last several decades, and really it doesn't seem like we've seen them countered until now. You mentioned the trade deals that President Trump has pulled together. We've seen now, I think, north of 80% of world GDP, or north of 85% of world GDP, has signed trade deals with the United States, Japan, India, most recently, the European Union, the United Kingdom, South Korea, et cetera. Can you talk to us about how President Trump is countering exactly that?
Well, it's as you've already mentioned, it's the economic tariff strategy of this administration. I was at the White House in the Rose Garden for the big announcement that President Trump made a year ago on tariffs, and it was an incredible moment because you realize that like no other president would have the guts, or dare I say the balls, to do what President Trump did when it came to tariffs, to reorient everything to put our interests ahead of foreign interests, and he did. He had the guts to do it, and he did it. And Wall Street and the big media and all the special interests said he was wrong and he shouldn't do it, and it was gonna send our economy over a cliff, and they were all wrong. I mean, the fact is they were all wrong. The tariffs worked. All of those deals that he made with foreign countries who were otherwise not enticed to come to the table and make deals with America that would put our interests over their interests. So President Trump accomplished that in a big way, and it immediately got China's attention. And we've seen their economy decline because of it, and we've seen benefits to our economy. In Indiana, once again, the manufacturing capital of America, and I remember on Liberation Day, like hours later, you had Eli Lilly, you had General Motors, you had Honda, Toyota, major manufacturers in my state who made big announcements immediately about bringing investment and jobs back to Indiana and the United States and taking it out of China. So much of that is to be celebrated. There's so much more work to do. I mean, the AI race is top of mind to me. How do we win it? We can't sell out our interests by sending our best chips to China and helping their hand over the interest of ours. So that's something that I hope President Trump will focus on in these negotiations and in his meetings in Beijing. Talk rare earth minerals. How do we decouple ourselves from the leverage that China has over us on rare earth minerals by investing in that here and in allied countries? And by the way, my last rambling thought: the new national security strategy, which puts our interests in our hemisphere front of at the top of our priority list, is historically significant. I mean, President Trump putting his mark on the Monroe Doctrine, the Donroe Doctrine, or the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, whatever you want to call it, and telling the Chinese that you're not welcome in our backyard. I mean, that's the type of America First leadership this country deserves and has been desperate for so long. And we're getting it. And then you look at what President Trump has done to, when he came into office, the threats around the world from China, Russia, Iran, but also Venezuela, Cuba, and he's taking these major threats off of the table that all work in tandem in China's interest. What's going on in Iran, but also what happened in Venezuela, taking those threats off the table to strengthen America's hand. This is a significant and historic moment, unlike anything I think that any of us have seen in our lifetime.
Sure. And now your now former colleague, now former senator, now secretary, Mark Wayne Mullen. We just did a big interview with him a little over a month ago. We were going to release it right before the China trip, but one of the things that we focused on was it was a big deep dive into the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the things he said, he was just sworn in as Secretary of Homeland Security this week, is that, and I believe at the cabinet meeting today at the White House, he's talking about how what the Chinese are trying to do is control our currency. They're trying to control our manufacturing. As you mentioned there, Indiana is this manufacturing powerhouse of the United States, but they're also trying to control our health care, right? And that's one of the things that our friends here that are sponsoring this event here today are very focused on. I know you've written letters to the FDA raising questions about these cheap Chinese compound drugs that are getting pushed into the country. The nation is on a big kick right now, very focused on these GLP-1s. We're seeing these cheap Chinese compounds coming in. I know you've pressed them on this, and you've introduced legislation as well, the SAFE Act, about this. Can you talk to us about where things stand with regard to this? Have you gotten clear answers from the FDA? Do we have any progress update on this? And tell us about the SAFE Act and what that would do.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the early confirmation hearings, and my my first moments in the U.S. Senate after 8 years in the House. And when we confirmed Secretary Kennedy, the first question I asked him on the Help Committee, which I sit on, was about this issue. I mean, how do we untangle this mess with 30 to 40% of pharmaceutical manufacturing happens in China, our biggest enemy? If we didn't learn anything from COVID and how they leverage that moment against us, it should be this: that we should get all of that out of China as much as we can. And we see what they do to manipulate so many different things, but when it comes to pharmaceuticals and drug compounding is the wild west of drug manufacturing. So, and when they manipulate the holes in our laws for their benefit and screw great American companies like Eli Lilly over the interest of American and in their favor, and flood our country with cheap and dangerous ingredients for drug compounding of GLP-1s or whatever drugs those might be, and then the FDA turns a blind eye to it. I mean, that's not American first. So fortunately, we have a team at HHS from the top with Secretary Kennedy to Dr. Oz, the new leadership at FDA, and others that we're talking to. I mean, we introduced a bipartisan bill. You talked about the SAFE Act, and to try to crack down on this, I've written letters to the administration. We have to put our interests ahead of theirs and make sure that the FDA treats drug testing and manufacturing that comes out of China by the same standards and rules that they do in the United States. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Why would we make it easier for them to flood our country with dangerous drugs and manipulate the market in the United States, and make it easier for them to do that, but harder for great American companies? Is completely backwards, and President Trump and his team that are in office right now are serious about fixing it.
Yeah, so there's a thing called the FDA Green List, is what they call it, right? And there's apparently a bunch of Chinese companies that are on this green list. It's mind-boggling to me how they would get, this kind of a thing. Can you tell us about this? What is a green list, and what are these companies that are on it? How do they get on it? What do we need to do about this? I saw news just the other day that this company called Sinopep or whatever is getting in on it, and they literally have, I've seen reports, they have like a whole unit in there that's designed to try to spread CCP propaganda. It's amazing to me that this is happening.
I mean, seriously, if it weren't for Breitbart, we would never know. We would never hear about these things. It doesn't get covered by big media, by mainstream media. But fortunately, Breitbart and you and others in this room are taking this seriously. So you have these bureaucratic processes that happen that aren't transparent, that happen in the darkness of big government, and you have Chinese companies get on these lists and get special favors. So we're trying to exploit it. We're trying to crack down on it. We're begging the FDA to do something about it, and we're just getting started on that front. But you all have helped expose it, and we appreciate that.
Okay, so now you mentioned the percentages of drugs that are getting manufactured in China, that are getting developed in China. I mean, a big part of their Belt and Road Initiative is, and we saw this really at the beginning of COVID, really kind of forced it into, I know everybody likes to forget about COVID, it was 6 years ago, but the point is that, they shut the world down. And what we're seeing is massive increases in percentages of them making and developing various drugs. They're trying to build their own biotech empire. That's the future of healthcare. What's to stop them from saying at one point or another, if we end up in a real heated economic crisis with them, or worse, a war or something, from saying, you know what, no more antibiotics for America, no more cancer treatments for America? I mean, what do we do? How do we get our own industry making this stuff in America, in Indiana and elsewhere throughout our heartland, rather than over there?
Well, the good news is that's happening. I mean, I keep mentioning Eli Lilly because they're a great Hoosier company, headquartered in Indianapolis, and they immediately made a significant announcement. I mean, it was like, what was it, $12 billion of bills saying a lot more, 24. Yeah, it was significant. It was a lot. It was a lot of billions of dollars of investment that they were bringing out of China and around the world and back to the United States because of President Trump's tariffs. So Then you had a lot of other medical device companies and other significant companies that followed and made announcements just like that. So the tariffs are a big part of it, but we have to find ways to incentivize it, to help these companies make that move. I mean, I'm convinced that Americans get this more than people in Washington
Sure.
D.C. to these and Wall Street, like your average normal working class American is they don't understand why we're not doing it sooner than what we are to get these companies out of China and moving back home, because they understand the national security risk and why it matters. So we have to continue to light a fire, and I know that'll be a part of the conversations that the president has. Secretary Bessent, by the way, he was a part of the last forum that we had that you sponsored. He's been the chief negotiator, the tip of the spear, and sort of listing out what our priorities are and what that negotiation looks like, and I know this is part of it.
Right. Okay. So now another thing that I hear is that they, in China, with regard to clinical trials, they literally can force anyone there, because it's a communist regime, right? It's different than here, right? They force all sorts of people to take part in clinical trials, unwilling subjects. It's an inherent advantage that they have over here. And then I think they're a little bit fast and loose with some of the way that they do the testing. How do we, again, help American companies
this is
combat
crazy.
that?
I was in 2023, which is the last year that I have numbers for. There were 11,000 clinical trials that happened in China versus 7,500 in America. So that's a wild statistic, and we're allowing that to happen again because the Chinese are exploiting holes in our laws and the weaknesses of the FDA. That's not providing the same level of oversight on those clinical trials there that they do for ones that happen in the U.S. So you make it too hard to do it here and too easy to do it there, and those trends are going to continue. So we have to enforce laws that treat them those clinical trials the same way, whether they're done there or here, and incentivize these companies to do them in the United States.
Okay, so Senator, where I want to bring this in for a landing here to wrap up is back to the big picture. Again, we're looking forward to the president's visit upcoming in May. We've definitely got their attention. The president has been, beating them up and down the court. We're talking basketball right now because we're in the middle of March Madness. I know Indiana, Hoosiers, big basketball state.
Football school.
But the president's beating China up and down the court all over the world, right? Like geopolitically, I'm shocked that they're even doing the meeting. But the point is that it really does feel like the next stage of this is that we've really got to start beating them here too, right? Like, I mean, just big picture. What is your message, your takeaway here? What do we do to turn the tide even more than we've already done the first year or so here of President Trump's second term?
I go back to the AI race. We have to win the AI race, and we can't let the Chinese win it, because we know that if they win it, they'll seize the moment and dominate us in the process. So, and I've always said America can't lead abroad when we're weak at home. President Trump is making us strong again. He's bringing back the Made in America economy, which is fundamental to our strength and our ability to be the leader that America deserves to be around the globe, that we haven't been for a long time before President Trump. So that's the focus. I think a lot of this comes back to not to be repetitive, but AI and you think about who gets there first. I mean, does China win the AI race? Do they develop algorithms that cure cancer, and do they use AI to dominate us in the authoritarian ways that we know that they will, that Senator Cotton speaks about in quite a bit in his book? And we can't let them do that. We have to win the race, and we can't turn over the keys to China by selling ourselves out and giving them our best chips and our best technologies that they can use to beat us.
Senator Jim Banks, really want to thank you for joining us. I know you got to get back to the Senate to go vote, so thank you for taking the time.
Good to see you.
Okay. All right, and again, folks, I want to welcome up to the stage now, and thank you to the Senator. I know that they're running tight on schedule up there in the Senate because they've got votes ongoing today. So I want to welcome up to the stage, we've got Patsy Reitzman and Raul Lopez from RX Border Defense. Patsy Reitzman is a founding member and board member of our sponsor, RX Border Defense. She started her career in healthcare in 1980, working for EDS's healthcare division, and currently owns ManageHealthCareCosts.com, where she consults and speaks nationwide, educating businesses, organizations, legislators, and individuals about imperatives to know in healthcare. And then Raul Lopez is also a founding member and board vice president of RX Border Defense. In addition, he has served as the executive director of a prison ministry and mentoring organization for more than 20 years, where he was focused on the re-entry of thousands of men being released from prison. He is also the co-founder and chairman of Latinos for Tennessee, a nonprofit focused on empowering Tennesseans through faith, family, and freedom and fiscal responsibility. Raul was born in Havana, Cuba, and came to the United States at age 5 after his family escaped from communism. So he knows personally very well the threats of communism. So I want to welcome both of them up to the stage right now. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys, to both of you. So. Yep, thank you. Okay, so lots to talk about here. We just heard from Senator Banks about a lot of these different things, but I want to start pretty broad here. Raul, as someone who personally knows the costs and the consequences and the threats of communism, can you tell us how important it is that we get this stuff right?
It's very important. Growing up, excuse me, in a communist country, the first thing you realize is they want to control you, and physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And if they come now and try to take control of our medicine, they control us. And they can basically, communism is all about world dominance. And the only way they can have world dominance is if they control the United States of America. And they can do that without even firing a single shot by controlling our medicine cabinet.
So Patsy, similar question to you again, and then can you kind of lay out the broader threats that exist here and what do we do to combat them, and then we'll get into some of the specifics.
I so appreciate what Senator Banks said about what's going on with the FDA, what the president is doing. I think that the obesity drugs, we are the largest, the most obese nation in the world, and I think this is a test balloon for China. Just some things that are happening. Last night, I just Googled one ad for obesity drugs. And in a matter of a little over an hour, I had 29 targeted ads and reels hit me on drugs, obesity drugs. When I looked at all of the detail, it was exactly what China is doing. And I am an educated consumer, particularly about this, but I could not find in the detail where the drug was made, what were the ingredients of the drug. And what we're finding is Senator Banks mentioned a green list. It's really a white list of companies that are not being detained at the border. Over 50% of those companies are Chinese companies. And I have a letter from the FDA. Now, the FDA has high standards for the American population and the American companies, but they don't have those same standards for what is coming across, for example, on that green list. Here's a letter, and Senator Banks had mentioned this company. It's Cinepop, I think.
Yeah.
When they went in and looked, there were insects running around. There's water coming in that should not have been there. There was bacteria that should not have been there. But guess what? They are on the approved green list for coming in the compound area. What I saw in the ads last night was they would talk about how the main name of the drug had been FDA approved, but these are compounding issues that are getting through, and it is extremely dangerous to us.
Yeah, so one of the things, so I was looking up some of the statistics on this last night as I'm preparing for this, I think there are hundreds, north of 1,500 adverse incidents, according to the FDA's own reporting. And I think dozens of cases of deaths, or at least more than a dozen. Talk to us about the adverse impacts that we're seeing from some of this stuff.
And I would say the adverse events are probably a lot more than that, because the online...
They're not reported.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The online community does not have to report those. We have one example of someone, a lady in Kentucky. She had only been on the drug for 1 month and had kidney failure. Now, let's just take that example and say that there was a bad batch and 1,000 people got that drug and had to have kidney transplants. The finger is going to be pointed back at the FDA on that, and we don't have 1,000. So people are looking at it. The ads I saw last night was all about cost and all about how quickly you could get it. No doubt they were from Chinese entities, but people are not looking at the long-term cost when individually we, our family members, are affected greatly with our health and the long-term cost of that, or deaths.
Mm-hmm. So Raul, lay out for us the broader geopolitical aims of a communist regime in Beijing. Like, what, again, as somebody who has, escaped communism in Cuba, Beijing much more powerful than Cuba. What are they trying to do with this stuff? Because I don't think this is an accident, is it?
No, of course not. Again, what China or any communist system wants to do is control you, and you become dependent on them in every aspect of your life. They destroyed my family in Cuba, and the way they did that is, try to separate children from family members, whatever it takes. They've tried to do that with TikTok. They come from all different angles. It's like a Trojan horse. They come in with cheap prices on medicine and all that, but then they exit with a Chinese dragon, basically, and burn up everything in sight. So their main goal is to have world dominance, and the best way to do that is, if they control our medicine, they control everything. Look what happened during COVID and that. They threatened, and who's to say they won't do that again?
So Patsy, the impact of this is it has a major negative impact on our American ability to make and produce and develop treatments. Walk us through what impact this is having negatively on American pharmaceuticals that are actually following the FDA rules, not the ones that are cutting the corners like this through these green lists or white lists or whatever we're calling it. What impact is it having? And then what is the long-term ramifications for that? Because the bigger issue here is again, what we're seeing is, I think the stats were, it was something like 10% or so of drugs were being developed in China, just a few years ago, 5 or 6, 7 years ago. Now it's like 30%, right? Like, so it's, I'm oversimplifying that, but it's a massive increase in just a few years that they're doing on this. So what is the impact on the American pharmaceutical industry, and how is China building this, biotech empire, if you will, very quickly?
If the money is not coming into America, there are American standards, and we feel very comfortable with those American standards. We know the pharmaceutical companies they do the research and development, and that is a great deal of cost to do that. We are one of the first markets on new treatments for things. We are looked at as the leader, or as a leader. But if China continues with the financial component, and they are given the authority to continue to affect our healthcare system like they are, that reduces what we can do as Americans and what we can do as American companies. It's basically putting a price fix on what's happening in America. I'm going to mention a few other drugs. The obesity drugs are huge. And I looked up some statistics. It's less than 1 in 8 adults are on obesity drugs. But here's some other drugs.
That's a huge number, by the way.
It's huge. And
yeah. Millions and millions of
people. And I looked, I can't confirm this number, but they were saying with females, it's 1 in 5 that are on obesity drugs. But let me mention some other pharmaceuticals that China has control over. Antibiotics, they have 90% control. Painkillers, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, 70 to 95%. Steroids, cardiovascular drugs, sterile products, and medical supplies, and we have found contaminants in those. So I have a great concern that our trust in the FDA, as it should be for America, they are allowing the Chinese to come in with lack of quality. It is harmful to the Americans from a health perspective. It's harmful to Americans from a financial perspective, and in the development of drugs that will take care of issues in the future.
Right. So now, Raul, let me ask you this, because I asked this to the senator towards the end of the interview. What's to stop a rogue communist regime that is hell-bent on power and control, as we're talking about, and we've got our map over there where they're trying to take over the world, literally, through the Belt and Road Initiative. What's to stop them? Let's say we end up at really heated economic tensions between us, or worst case, a war, from stopping us, is what Patsy's just talking about there. About 90% of our antibiotics are coming from there. To stop them from sending antibiotics over here. Wouldn't they do that? I mean, that's a logical step for a communist regime that's hell bent on world control to hurt people.
Yeah, China will do whatever we allow them to do, and not only do that, but then go an extra mile. That's their philosophy. Again, it's to take over the world, and I'm shocked that there is a green list or a green light to a communist country. It should be a red light. It should be, Trump did a great job of building a beautiful wall to secure our country. Well, the FDA needs to build a beautiful wall, not allowing these types of drugs to come into our country.
So let me ask you both this question too. So look, I get it. Consumers are rightly concerned about drug prices, and we've seen what the current administration has done and the previous administration focused on the most favored nations thing. I get it. What they're trying to do is lower drug prices, but I think you guys have a different take on this, right? Like, so explain for us what that whole situation does for the long-term stability of the biotech industry here in the United States and the development of drugs and so on and so forth. What would you guys say about that?
I think we're the most favored nation. I support just about everything I have seen our president do, and I was so proud to be a voter for him. But I do think that's one area where a mistake is being made, because I think, in a way, most favored nation, we're putting a cap on pricing, and it negatively affects us. And in essence, it kind of is bringing in a socialized structure in pricing for drugs.
Yeah, my family risked their lives to get away from communism, and we came to a country that we believe in capitalism and competition. Because with competition, there comes accountability, and also comes the best product possible. And if you don't allow that, you don't allow the market to do it, you're going back to communism.
So let me ask you again, so we're talking about all these different issues, whether it's the green list, white list, whether it's the MFN stuff or drug prices, or the manufacturing, development of drugs, et cetera. How do we solve these problems? Because I think what we were talking about is that the biggest thing that we need to see from this administration across the board, and from any administration really, and this is from the federal government, state governments, et cetera, communication, right? Like actually warning people about the risks here. What are some of the things you guys would recommend to the Trump administration, if they happen to be watching this, which I hope they are? What would you say to the FDA commissioner, the HHS secretary, the president, the vice president? What do we need to see from them to truly revitalize America's pharmaceutical industry so that we don't fall victim to the Chinese Communist Party? Patsy, you start, and then we'll hear from Raul.
I was very pleased to hear what Senator Banks said about HHS, Robert Kennedy, and what is taking place with Dr. Oz, that they are looking at this. But the FDA right now is a huge problem with what they are allowing on the green list. Transparency. We don't know what companies are on that green list right now because they've been redacted. Every ad that I looked at last night, in wanting to find this information, and being an educated consumer and knowing what's going on, I could find nowhere where the drugs were coming from. I could find nowhere what the ingredients were. And some of the ingredients are not even approved for human consumption. They are approved for animal consumption. So I think transparency, I think the president needs to come down hard on the FDA, because what they are allowing is going to possibly do what Raul said. And we are allowing a border issue with China to take over our healthcare system with a lot of things right now, and it needs immediate attention.
Raul,
I think that's very well said. You know, I mean, to me, it's pretty simple. You hold China to at least the same standard that we hold American companies to. And I would even go an extra step to a higher standard. Like you said, more accountability, more transparency, because their motives are not to help the American people. Their motive is to control and have us dependent on them. So then whenever they want to do something, they could just pull our strings. And that's what China does.
Yeah, so another thing I would ask too is we keep hearing about the threats to consumers here. What would be both of your guys' advice to consumers, right? Like, what would be your advice to the average person? So somebody that gets bombarded with the same ads that you did last night, Patsy, what would you say they should do to educate themselves about this and to learn more about it and protect themselves from this stuff?
I think America in general needs to do more advertising. All of those ads I saw last night, I'm sure, and underneath the comments were, yes, this is a fabulous company, yes, this drug has worked, and I'm sure much of that was generated by the Chinese. So do we have something that is coming out and being truthful about what can happen, like the things that we have just talked about? I'm not seeing anywhere the things that we need to be informed about and the transparency, and I totally think that Trump needs to put his thumb on the FDA about this.
Yeah, and you know, I grew up many years in the state of North Carolina, and we were a big tobacco state, and every pack of cigarettes had a big warning label. And I don't see why we can't, made in China, warning. You know, it's just, we need to educate the citizens, you know, and people need to work with their doctors, work with their families, and also have testimonies of what's happening.
Yeah, I'm still shocked as I've been preparing for all of this, the things I've learned about the FDA green list and these various Chinese companies, especially the Sinopep thing, and apparently it's very recent. Like in the last couple of days, there's been some major developments. All the stuff that you were talking about there regarding the facility and the stuff that goes into it. I got to tell you, some of this stuff, it's shocking to me, and you know, I want to hear from the FDA commissioner. I wish we could get him to do a big interview with us and talk to him about this, because and it's not just that. There's also stuff, like I saw a report last night about this. Our good friend Laura Loomer out there, I think, did a big thing about this, and I recommend people look at it. She was talking about how that inside the Sinopep company, they have like a whole universe of CCP propagandists, right? Like, absolutely. And so, I mean, it's dangerous. It's like, and I think we have to hear from the FDA commissioner about this. And so, my hope is that he will see this interview that we're doing right now and come out and address this stuff, and then start changing course here and doing something about it.
I think the states are perhaps doing more than at the national level. I think we had 37 attorneys general that did some focus on this. So, and we have so many mechanisms to educate our public and to put some rules in place. We have HHS. We have each state Medicaid program, Medicare program, all of the Obamacare. We have entities and ways that we can communicate with the patients, and that's not being done.
Yeah, Raul, any last thoughts?
You know, we just got to realize that China's like a black widow, and they're trying to lure us to eventually kill us and control us and be dependent totally on them.
And
yeah.
This is a test balloon, and right now, they're winning.
Yeah, Patsy Reitzman and Raul, I really want to thank both of you guys for this, and we're gonna take we're gonna blow right through our planned break. We've got our next guest here because we're running on Senate vote schedules, guys, right? Because we got 2 U.S. senators here today. So we have Secretary Chad Wolf and Ambassador Jeffrey Garish here. Welcome them up to the stage next. So thank you guys both. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. So, Mr. Ambassador, good to see you both. Okay, I want to read both of your bios really fast for our audience so that they know who we're talking to here. So we've got Mr. Chad Wolf was the acting secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during President Trump's first term. Currently the vice chair at American Global Strategies, chair of Homeland Security, Immigration and Western Hemisphere at the America First Policy Institute, and was a senior advisor at the Protecting America Initiative. He's received the 9/11 Medal, the DHS Distinguished Service Medal, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, and we've got Ambassador, I've got all my cards out of order here, so hold on. We've got former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative during the first Trump administration, Ambassador Jeffrey Garish, helped shape U.S. trade strategy across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, leading efforts to tackle global trade barriers and unfair practices. He served as the lead negotiator for the landmark U.S.-China Economic and Trade Agreement and played a central role in major agreements with Japan, Mexico, Canada, and Korea. In addition, he led the Export-Import Bank of the United States as acting president and chairman. So thank you to both of you guys for joining us here. So lots to talk about here. So Mr. Secretary, I'll start with, both of you guys, by the way, were there at the beginning of COVID. And so you guys saw some of the real world impacts of kind of what we're talking about here today. So I want to start with that. I want to ask both of you guys that from your guys' perspectives. Both of you guys were serving in the first Trump administration when COVID hit. We saw the way that the Chinese Communist Party handled it. So Mr. Secretary, if you want to start for us, tell us what you witnessed there at the Department of Homeland Security and what were they doing and what was the kind of the takeaways from that for the threats that loom ahead, possibly?
Well, I think, well, thank you again for hosting this today. I think from my perspective, when I reflect a little bit back on COVID and the department's role, I think the word dependency comes to mind, right? And how the U.S. was so dependent on all the PPE and everything that, everyday Americans needed in the country, and trying to get those resources and those materials out of a place like China or Southeast Asia and other places overseas back here in the U.S. And as COVID went on and on and on, I recall conversations we had saying, well, we can't let this happen again. We can't be dependent on a foreign adversary for really critical supplies and materials, in that case, as I said, PPE. And so you can now think about that concept, but think about it in other ways as well, and how we are still dependent, and sometimes incentivize that on the CCP and Chinese companies for a variety of different things. And so I think COVID was a little bit of a test case, unfortunately, but it also opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that as a great superpower, as the world's leading superpower, we actually don't produce a lot here, and that we are reliant, particularly for foreign countries and our adversaries in some cases, such as Chinese companies, to produce that. So I think that's the biggest takeaway, and again, that can be replicated over a variety of different industries.
Same question to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, well, I certainly have a similar recollection of what was going on at the time when COVID started, and similar experience. We saw what China was doing with respect to weaponizing its dominance in the PPE sector, and that's what China does do. They weaponize their dominance in supply chains, and we've now seen it, of course, more recently with rare earths and critical minerals as well. But back then, what happened was, of course, with the shortage of PPE in this country and the problems we were having in getting critical medical supplies, what I ended up having to do is negotiate with my counterpart, because we had just concluded the Phase 1 trade deal, and that was one avenue that we could pursue to try to negotiate with them to open up, the supply chains here for these products. And we had some success, but it was very, very difficult. But it shows exactly what the Chinese are capable of doing. And when we talk about their emergence in the biopharmaceutical sector and the emphasis that they placed on becoming a dominant global player in that industry, I think it creates real risks for us going forward.
Yeah, so one of the things, Mr. Secretary, so I did a big interview recently with the guy who's now in your old job, now Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen back when he was a senator a few weeks ago, and so we taped it ahead of the president's planned trip to China, and we were going to release it closer to when the president was going there. Obviously, that trip has been delayed now. He's going in May instead of April. But the fact is that in this whole interview with the now secretary, then senator, told me was all about how the Chinese are trying to essentially take over the world, right? We have this big map over here. This is the Belt and Road Initiative that's right behind us that we keep referring to. We were talking to Senator Banks about that earlier. We'll talk to Senator Cotton about it when he gets here in a little bit. We're doing this very much on the fly around Senate votes, guys. So the U.S. Senate floor schedule, we're working around that right now with Senator Thune and all those guys. But the fact is that one of the things that the now secretary told me, the then senator, is that that they are, there's a very concerted, serious, it's a 100-year plan that they've put together to try to take over the world. You probably saw a lot of this when you were secretary. Can you tell us about what they were trying to do here, specifically in the healthcare industry, but also more broadly than that? What are the Chinese efforts that they're trying to do here, whether it's buying our farmland or, doing all sorts of other things, taking over companies, et cetera? Walk us through it.
One of the first things I did when I became acting secretary is I looked around the department and I asked a number of our senior leaders, I said, tell me the top threats facing the homeland. And you would think that that's a very easy thing to do. And they kind of looked at me and said, well, we've never really put it in a report before. So we then asked them to do that. Mm-hmm. So we published in 2020, a Homeland Security Threat Assessment of sorts, which had outlined the threats facing the homeland at that time. And you can imagine border security, immigration, all of that was in there. But the threat from China was also included in there very, very specifically over other nation-state threats that had more of a terrorism bent to it. The Chinese threat was more economic. It was more, as you indicated, more long-term. And so when I think about the Chinese threat, I think of espionage, intellectual property theft, things like this, their abuse of the visa system, particularly our student visas, and things like that.
Birthright citizenship?
Citizenship. Yeah. But you start to see these types of threats morph over time. And now, we see things like medical devices where they're collecting patient data, right? And maybe that's a backdoor for CCP as well. Buying up American farmland, right? Infiltrating that ag supply chain is also very, very concerning. And so if you look across the board at a variety of different things, it's not just one industry or one sector. It's pretty robust. And then, of course, what they're doing with the actual pharmaceutical ingredients, which I know we'll talk about as well, is also very concerning because in my world, it feels a lot of like the threat of fentanyl that we tried to deal with back in 2017 and 18, well, throughout the first Trump administration, where we were identifying all these precursors, fentanyl precursors from China coming into the United States saying, this is a problem. This is killing Americans, and how do we address this issue? And of course, now they go through Mexico into the United States. But I see that now with pharmaceutical ingredients coming in.
So, Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned the Phase 1 trade deal. I can't help but notice that the timing of COVID right around that time. So I don't know if it's probably a coincidence. I hope so. But the fact is they certainly took advantage of COVID and used that to kind of rip up the trade arrangement that was worked through in that first term, in President Trump's first term. In the second term here, what we've seen the president do is through tariffs and a number of other actions. We've gotten now to a place where there are bilateral trade deals with, I think, north of 85% of world GDP. The latest big one is obviously India, but we've seen Japan, Korea, the European Union, the United Kingdom went first, our great old partner there. There are friends here in the room from Taiwan and Greece. But the fact is that the president really seems to be building towards this eventual meeting that he's going to have in May with Xi Jinping. A big part of this, of course, is going to be, the various health industry stuff that we're talking about, but more broader than that about U.S. efforts to counter CCP global domination efforts, right? And the president really does seem to be, beating them up and down the quarters. We were talking about there with Senator Banks. Senator Banks big basketball guy from Indiana, right? Like, so talk to us a little bit about, what would be your advice to the president going into this meeting with Xi upcoming in May, and kind of where things stand on the playing field as they exist right now between the U.S. and China.
Well, I think a lot of what both countries are really trying to do is develop some stability in the relationship between them. I think there are dependencies, frankly, on both sides. The Chinese have a dependency that they see on American technology and semiconductor technology in particular. The U.S. has dependence in a number of sectors, including, of course, rare earths and critical minerals, and they want to keep those flowing. But I think that's part of what they're trying to achieve. But I think more broadly, what the administration is trying to do is build up leverage through other trade deals that they're doing. As you mentioned, they've done trade deals, I think, with roughly about 18 countries at this point, and building a network of those deals. And a lot of those deals have provisions in them which are, I think, directed at China in terms of making sure we're cutting off transshipment from China and creating mechanisms where we can get those countries to take actions that threaten their own national security, but potentially our national security as well, related to China. Now, another thing I think the administration is doing here is they are trying to address these dependencies we have. And in critical minerals, we're doing deals and arrangements with countries and trying to develop an alternative supply to China. And in the pharmaceutical sector, what we're trying to do is get other countries to pay fair prices for drugs. They've done a deal with the UK on that front, where the UK has agreed to increase its spending on pharmaceuticals, in fact, double it over the next 10 years as a share of GDP, as a way to maintaining our leadership in that sector. And I think if we, one of the threats to that going forward, I think, and what's something that would play right into China's hands, and I know you were talking a little bit about this in the prior panel, but is to adopt most favored nation pricing and adopt price controls that other countries have put in place, because what that's going to do is cut the revenues for our pharmaceutical industry when China is on the rise and seeking to surpass us. You mentioned this earlier, that they've really targeted global dominance in a number of sectors through the Made in China 2025 plan, among other things. We tried to go after that in the first term, but I think one of the sectors that they're really targeting is the biotech and biopharmaceutical sector. And if we play into their hands and adopt price controls, I think we're going to develop even greater dependence on the Chinese in that sector as well, which they would gladly step into. And then we're going to be in a position where they could cut off supplies of critical medicines going forward.
Yeah, they are definitely eating into the market share, no doubt about this, in a big way. Like, I mean, compared to 2018, 2019, I think they've increased something like 20-something% in terms of the new drugs that are being developed. So, Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the ingredients in these drugs and whatnot. We're seeing the compounds, right? Like, and we were just talking about that with Patsy in the previous panel about these different things, and you can't really figure out what's in them, and you don't really know, and you don't know where the company is, and the consumers getting confused about it, and so on and so forth. And you made a really prescient point, comparing it kind of to like what we see with fentanyl, right? Like, and so in the precursors that go into the fentanyl. By the way, it's amazing to me. I think China could shut off the fentanyl today if they wanted to, right? Like, I mean, they could shut that off. They could shut this stuff off today if they wanted to. They're a communist regime. They have complete control over there, right? Like, I mean, it's not like a free market society over there. If the government says, if Xi Jinping says no more fentanyl precursors to America, there's no more fentanyl precursors to America. So let me ask you this. Kind of lay out for us what's happening on this front, and what consumers should be aware of, and what do we need to see from our government to more protect Americans?
Yeah, so I think this is two things. One is that's a national security issue, just because it involves the CCP, but it's also about protecting patients and everyday Americans, right? So we often talk about America first, putting Americans first in our policy decision making and kind of what we lay out. And so I think this fits nicely in that. Whereas, obviously GLP-1s are big. I think it was 1 in 8. I think the panel said it before me, 1 in 8 Americans is on that. So you want to make sure that type of drug is safe and secure, and you understand what ingredients are going into it. And if you have illicit ingredients coming in from China and not being administered in a way by the FDA that probably they could be, I think that's a real concern. And so and I think you have Senator Cotton coming up, and he's pointed this out as well, right? When you have shipments coming in and you have Americans getting sick and some even dying because they don't know what they're putting in their bodies, I think that becomes a national security issue very, very quickly. And so that's what's at stake here. And there's talk about a green list and how do you do that? And I think conceptually that's okay, right? Which is the idea that you're going to identify good ingredients and good actors versus bad ingredients and bad actors. Whether or not it's being administered in such a robust way to really protect Americans, I think that's a question that a lot of folks have.
And Mr. Ambassador, let me follow up on that with you, because you were in the room negotiating with these folks, right? Like, so take us inside the room. What is a negotiation with the CCP, trade folks about, like when it comes to stopping fentanyl, or when it comes to stopping these kinds of things, or what is that like? What do they say? Like, what do they do? Like, what are they? Because it's kind of strange to me. Why can't they just admit that they could stop it today, right? Like, if they wanted to, it's almost like they want us dying or something. I don't know.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, first of all, the negotiations with the Chinese are always difficult, incredibly difficult. They are tough negotiators, and what often happens is, they will tell you that they cannot do certain things, and they will make up every excuse that they can for why they can't get it done and why it's not a matter that's within their control, when in fact the facts are that in fact they could stop it if they wanted to. They could stop forced technology transfer. That was one of the issues we were dealing with. They could adopt a system where they protect intellectual property rights. So these are all things they could do, but of course they profess that they have an inability to do it. The other thing you encounter with the Chinese very often is you will negotiate provisions in an agreement. We were doing a trade agreement, and you will think you have reached agreement on particular terms. The text will go back. It will come back to you, and it's as if it never happened, right? They will constantly renege on the agreements that they've negotiated. I mean, you mentioned it earlier in terms of what they did with COVID. Now, the agreement remains intact. There are important provisions in there, but you saw what they did on the purchasing commitments, and they used COVID as an excuse, but they could have fulfilled those commitments, and they simply did not do so. So it's incredibly difficult. It's an incredibly frustrating exercise with them, because you constantly have to go over and talk about the same terms that you thought you had previously agreed to, and it's a never-ending battle.
So, Mr. Secretary, one of the things we were talking about the FDA green list here and these particular companies. We keep talking about this one company because it's in the news in the last couple of days. Is a Sinopep company, and apparently they have like a CCP, propaganda outfit and espionage outfit like inside the company, built into it and stuff. It's like mind-boggling to me. There's some of the things I've learned in just the last couple of days about this, as I've been doing research for this. But what would be your advice to the current administration, the new secretary, who just took over this week? He was just sworn in. He was at the cabinet meeting this morning with President Trump. What would be your advice to Secretary Mullen and more broadly the rest of the team? How do they confront this? What do they do about this? Like, how do they, from your experience from being there before, what do they need to do here to actually confront this stuff, stop it, and not let China operate?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, and I think everyone knows this, that any CCP, or I should say any Chinese company under Chinese law, has to report back information back to their intelligence function, back to the CCP. And so I think anytime the federal government is doing business with a Chinese government, with a Chinese company, they have to understand that. And so when I was at DHS, and I'm sure the incoming secretary will look at that as well, I know the Department of War and others are as well. I think anytime you're interacting with Chinese companies, you've got to put some firewalls in place. You've got to understand what the limitations need to be if you're going to do any business at all with them, which is questionable. So I think that is a concern. There's a number of things that DHS can continue to do to combat Chinese or malign Chinese influence here in the homeland. But again, as we talk about these pharmaceutical ingredients, that's something that obviously DHS can't do. We need the FDA, we need others to step up. And I think start to get a little bit of a different mindset here, which is this is about national security, the security of the country, and Americans every day. And it's a little different than maybe some of the other, pharmaceutical concerns that maybe they've dealt with in decades prior. We're now at a different level here when you're dealing with a nation-state issue and probably our top adversary as well. And so I think they need a little different lens on how they approach this, how they look at the issue and the threat, and hopefully they'll do that.
So, Mr. Ambassador, the Secretary just said something very important, I think, which is that there's no such thing as a private company in China, right? They all work for the government. They all report up to, we're used to, here in the United States, we have private companies here, right? Like that, you can't be compelled to produce stuff to the government unless there's like a lawful subpoena or something like that. There, it's part of the system, right? They all work for the Chinese Communist Party. They all report to one man, Xi Jinping. He is the dictator. He is in complete control. So again, what would be your advice to the current administration as they go, again, as the president goes over there to go meet with Xi Jinping next month? I mean, again, they're a huge country. There's 1.3 billion people there. It's not like we can just act like they don't exist. But the fact is that they've got to do something different here with regard to the mindset of how we approach stuff, because it is a very different system than what we are used to here.
Without a doubt, no question about it. And I mean, I think there are very savvy people in the administration who know these issues well. Ambassador Greer, Secretary Bessent are leading the negotiations on the U.S. side. We have to treat them as they are. They are our biggest adversary in the world, and they are our biggest threat. And we have to treat them accordingly. And I think what we're seeing here is we are seeing not complete decoupling necessarily, but there is a divorce that's happening here. And I think both sides are looking to maintain some stability, but they are trying to, move apart from each other. And I think that's what the United States has to continue to do. It has to continue to move away from China, eliminate or minimize our dependence on China to the greatest degree possible, build up our capabilities here in the United States to build back our manufacturing base. That's something that the president is trying to do through tariffs and through the investment deals that he's reaching with other countries, and develop, if we can't make the products here, at least do it through friendshoring, but as much as possible, bring the manufacturing back here and not give up our leadership in sectors like the pharmaceutical sector.
And this would be where I would kind of land with both of you guys. So I ask you both, again, how do we, as a nation here, protect, because I do think that the president geopolitically around the world, if you look at the various trade deals, you look at the various military actions he's been taking this term, you look at the various other, around the world, I mean, he's, beating, I can't believe that Xi's actually going to do this meeting, right? That's where I'm at. I'm shocked that that's actually going to happen, because I think he's been beating China everywhere, up and down the court, right? But the fact is that at home, there's still major threats here that are happening here in the homeland that we've got to get under control. We've got to get our manufacturing going again. We got to protect ourselves from these various, deadly chemicals. So to both of you guys, in the last couple minutes we got left here, what would be your advice about what we do here to take this effort that we've seen from President Trump quite clearly the first year or so of his second term to the next level?
Yeah, I would say, obviously, as the cabinet, you take your lead from the president, right? He's going to be interacting with all these world leaders, setting the tone, setting the policy, and then you go back to your departments and your agencies to say, what are the authorities that I have at the Department of Homeland Security, at the FDA, at the Department of Treasury? What are the authorities that I have there that help propel or help achieve the goals that the president has set out? And so I know at DHS, when I was there, we had an action plan, sort of how to counter malign Chinese influence in the U.S. action plan, and trying to meet those milestones. So I'm sure the cabinet's a very competent cabinet. They're great. I'm sure they're doing that agency by agency and department by department. And I would say that your runway or the level of action and activity that you give to that, it can't be. You can't do too much there, right? it needs to be immediate and it needs to be ongoing.
And Mr. Ambassador?
Yeah, so as an overall matter, I would say the president should continue his efforts and further his efforts to stop global free riding. He's done that in the defense spending context, where he's gotten the NATO countries to agree to do more and other countries around the world to do more. He should do that with respect to pharmaceutical pricing, where he should get other countries to pay fair prices for pharmaceuticals and do the kinds of deals he did with the UK. And I think they are looking to do deals with other countries around the world. And I would, in the trade context specifically, recreate the tariff regime that he had previously, which I think he's trying to do through Section 301, and bring back manufacturing to the United States, as well as create the leverage to get the kinds of deals he's already gotten done with a number of countries, which have been fantastic trade deals done in a very short period of time, but you need the leverage to create the ability to get those deals.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this. Folks, I think we're going to take a quick 5-minute break because we're waiting on Senator Cotton to get over here from the Senate, because I know they've got votes scheduled. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. Everybody go grab a drink, go to the restroom, do whatever you got to do. We'll come right back up when Senator Cotton's here. Thank you guys, both of you. Yeah. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Okay, guys, we're very pleased to be joined by Senator Tom Cotton from the great state of Arkansas. He's the chairman of the Senate Republican Conference. So, Senator, thank you for joining us here. A lot of stuff that we're talking about here, but the big topic du jour is the threat of the Chinese Communist Party to the United States. One of the things we've been kind of doing here is with each of the panels and discussions that we're doing, we talked to your colleague, Senator Banks, earlier, as well as kind of starting very big picture here and laying out how the Chinese Communist Party is, basically trying to take over the world. And we have a map over here with us right now of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I want to see if you can explain for us, what is the Belt and Road Initiative and what are the Chinese Communist Party trying to do around the world to take over the world, essentially? They're seeking global domination.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks, Matt, for having me here to talk about this very important topic, and thanks to Breitbart for hosting this conference. If I could start even higher than the Belt and Road Initiative for a moment.
Certainly.
You have in front of you copies of my little book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China, and the first thing you can't say, the first chapter of that book, is that China is an evil empire. And that is an obvious allusion to Ronald Reagan's statement in 1983 that Soviet Russia was an evil empire that scandalized civilized Washington, but it was the truth, and it's still the truth about China today. It's still communist, even though it has adopted a lot of Western economic practices for its own socialist benefit. And Xi Jinping is a through and through Marxist, and there's no doubt about that. If you see what he says, if you see what the party puts out in their name, they put the party above all else, above the state, above society, above God, and they do want to dominate the world. And what would domination look like? Look what they do to their own people. They've been committing a slow-motion genocide in Tibet for 70 years. They've been putting genocide on fast forward against the Uyghur people, a religious and ethnic minority in northwest China. They broke all their promises to Great Britain and the civilized world in Hong Kong and cracked down there and deprived Hong Kongers of the freedoms they enjoyed for centuries. This is what it would look like if they ran the world. And the Belt and Road Initiative here is just an example of how they're trying to extend communist Chinese influence around the world. It is a multi-trillion-dollar effort to get their hooks into other countries, mostly poorer third world countries that do need a lot of infrastructure development. But as many of them have come to recognize, China is not exactly a good lending partner. The best example of this is in Sri Lanka, where they promised to build a giant port, a port that would seem to be far beyond the needs of Sri Lankan shipping, either import or export, at onerous terms, and that would default to Chinese control if Sri Lanka defaulted on those terms, as they inevitably did. And within a very short period of time, guess what? Chinese warships started showing up in Sri Lanka, which is where, right off the coast of China's old nemesis, India. Or look at some of the other locations on this map. Places like the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab al-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Panama Canal over there. All critical waterways around the world in which China wants to exert a measure, if not total control. Control that can be latent, that can put pressure not only on those countries, but the rest of the world that depend on them, and that can be switched on in a moment of crisis, say tensions rising over Taiwan. And it's not even a good deal for these countries who, again, many of them need ports and airports and roads and railroads. Now, they may not need them on the scale that China wants to build them for their own purposes of basically creating economic vassal states, but it's not like China uses local workers or uses products. They take all of their excess labor supply and their excess capacity and export that as well. So, workers in a poor African nation don't get to build the bridge. They don't get to build the runway. They don't get to build the harbor. It's Chinese, essentially indentured servants, and it doesn't even really help the local economy either. They usually live on camps They import all their food and other goods, stuff that you and I might buy at places like Walmart for our household, on those camps, all coming from China. So the local civilians in these countries don't even benefit from the multi-billion-dollar projects that are going in, unless they're in government and getting kickbacks and other corrupt payments. So it's just one example, one concrete example of how Communist China tries to extend its influence around the world, far beyond its own geographic neighborhood.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, because that is the topic of, everybody is talking about the Strait of Hormuz right now, obviously, because that's where the oil moves through in the Middle East and with the war in Iran. One of the things that I think that, and I think you'll agree with me on this, is that I think there is, it's not the only reason why we're at war with Iran, but it's a major reason why is China, right? Like, can you explain for us about, how that is connected into that? And then I kind of want to get into some of the other actions that the administration's taken, whether it's trade or military actions that we've seen from President Trump here in his second term, because I think that if you look at Venezuela, you look at several of the other trade and peace agreements that he's made, with the certain ones in Africa, et cetera, all of these things have a China component to them. So explain for us specifically about Iran first, then we'll get into some of the other ones.
Well, China and Iran have been allies for some time now. One thing that they have in common, despite their many differences, is that they don't want to have the U.S. calling the shots in their international order. They don't want the United States to be the dominant superpower. China wants to be that, and Iran is happy to help them achieve that. One way they've done that over the years is Iran exports the lion's share of its black market oil to China through various means, like ship-to-ship transfers and small refineries that are somewhat off the grid in China, to help China on its huge energy needs. Same thing with Venezuela, by the way, too. China, in return, has helped send arms to Iran over the years. They've collaborated in various ways in the Middle East as well, again, to try to upset the American-led order there with Israel and with our Arab friends. But again, the president, as he has said many times, launched this war with Israel against Iran because Iran's nuclear program and its vast missile arsenal posed an unacceptable risk to the United States, an existential risk to our friends in the region. Good example of that I've been talking about for some time, and I told us helpfully proved me correct last week, was the intermediate range ballistic missile that was shot at Diego Garcia, our base in the Indian Ocean. As we just had testimony this morning at the Armed Services Committee, it is a very small step, not a very big technological step, from having an intermediate range missile that could hit a base in the Indian Ocean to having an intercontinental missile that could hit the United States. That step is measured in months, not years. That's the main reason President Trump took the step he did. And what Iran has done in the Strait of Hormuz and taking that shot at Diego Garcia is not a reason to step back or to ask for a ceasefire. It's a reason to see it through, as President Trump has said. We can't allow a revolutionary terrorist regime to continue to hold one of the world's most strategic waterways, all of the Middle East, and increasingly all of the world at risk, using, in some cases, Chinese technology and know-how.
Right, but again, a lot of this has to do with international trade. A lot of it has to do with oil. A lot of it has to do with the waterways that we're talking about here. More broadly, again, than this particular specific war in action. But one of the things I look at when I look at the Venezuela action too, it's very not lost on me that the night that President Trump authorized this capture of Nicolas Maduro, and he's facing trial today, I believe. He's in court today in New York. But the night that happened, the Chinese delegation that was there to continue their negotiations over Venezuelan oil that the Venezuelans were selling to them at the massive discounts, I believe, had touched down in Caracas, right? Yeah. Like they were there. They were there that night when that happened. So I mean, it does feel like there's a China tie-in to almost every single action that we're seeing militarily from this president.
In many cases, the oil was free from Venezuela to China to pay off some of these old bad loans that Venezuela had under things like the Belt and Road Initiative. So again, just like with Iran, China was getting the lion's share of Venezuelan oil, which was propping up the corrupt Maduro regime, which had flooded our countries with migrants and drugs, and was allowing not just China, but Iran and even terrorists like Hezbollah to run wild in our background. But most places you turn, yes, there is an angle to the U.S.-China conflict, because again, China's ambition is not to coexist peacefully. It's not just to be able to call the shots in its own neighborhood in East Asia. It is to replace the United States as the world's dominant superpower.
Right. So now, the fast forward to where we are today, the president yesterday announced that he has rescheduled his meeting to go meet with Xi Jinping in China, in Beijing. It's going to happen the second week of May. It was supposed to happen the first week of April. I get it, the war with Iran. We'd expect that to be potentially over by then, so that's the hope. And so they've rescheduled it to mid-May. What are some of the things you're expecting out of this upcoming meeting between President Trump and President Xi? What would be your advice to the president going into that meeting? What does he need to be prepared for? It seems like I don't know if this is the end or if it's the beginning of something, right? Like in terms of where things are going. What are your thoughts?
Well, another one of the things you can't say about China is that China has been waging economic world war against the United States. China didn't become wealthy and powerful just on its own accord. It did so by cheating and harming American workers and businesses in every way possible. And for too long, presidents of both parties let them get away with that. The idea that if we exported some of our surplus prosperity, if you put it, in the terms they often did, that China would go wealthy and they'd pull in their horns and they'd be a normal nation and we could all live together peacefully and happily. Obviously, that's not what happened. They used the economic wealth that they expropriated from us to fund the massive military buildup in the history of peacetime. So I think that what the president is going to be focused on is that economic warfare, the intellectual property theft, the dumping, the unlawful subsidies, the protectionism. Getting our products into China, protecting our own businesses from Chinese predations, and making sure that they compete on a level playing field. There are certain critical industries that he'll probably prioritize because they're most essential for our health and our safety. So for instance, the pharmaceutical industry, which is unusually dependent upon China, as we learned during the coronavirus pandemic, rare earth elements, which are not really rare, but the mining of them and the manufacturing of them especially are rare, and China's used illegitimate means to corner the market on those things. The batteries that can be made, all of these feed in not just, again, to our national security, but to our prosperity, because everything has these elements and batteries in them, from the laptops and phones I see on the table, to your refrigerator, to your television, to your automobile, and yes, unfortunately, to a lot of our military aircraft and ships. So I think the president will be very focused on trying to probably not stop, because I don't think you can count on Chinese communists to stop, but using the leverage that we do have, being the world's largest economy, perhaps having not just taken down Venezuelan oil exports, but Chinese or Iranian oil exports to China, and get a better deal to curtail these economic crimes that China has committed against the United States for so long.
So what we've seen since President Trump's return to the White House, we saw him do the tariffs, Liberation Day last year. I know the whole world freaked out about it at the time, but since then we've now seen north of 85% of world GDP has made trade deals, bilateral deals with the United States. The president has built enormous leverage with this. The latest big one was, of course, India. But we've seen Japan, we've seen Korea, we've seen the European Union, the United Kingdom, et cetera, have all, and more, have made trade deals. I know I'm probably leaving several out. But the fact is we've seen a number of these trade deals. We've also seen peace deals, right? Like Rwanda and Congo is a really big one because there's a lot of, you speak of rare earths and the critical minerals and stuff in the ground there. There's a lot of stuff there, and especially in the DRC. So can you lay out for us, it really does seem like President Trump has had a full-scale, I mean, we're in the middle of March Madness right now with basketball. He's running the full-court press back and forth against China everywhere around the world. And it really does seem like it is I'm actually kind of shocked Xi's going to actually go forward with the meeting, but I think he probably has to, right? Like,
Yeah.
So kind of lay out for us the bigger, broader strategy, if you will, that we're seeing through the trade deals, through the peace deals, through the military economic strength. It's really a full-scale peace. You know, we talk about peace through strength from, you know, President Trump has added extra components to this of American strength.
Well, it's a regrettable fact that even some of our friends and allies have not treated us very well when it comes to trade flows. Some of this goes back to the early days of the Cold War, when understandably American statesmen were more focused on stopping the spread of communism, especially when a lot of the countries that were now our allies had just essentially been pancaked by the war and the need to build them up. That should have stopped long ago. You know, once all of our friends in places like Japan and in Europe were back on their feet and producing. So we have a lot of legitimate grievances with friends and allies who are security partners who aren't always the best economic partners. President Trump campaigned 11 years ago, 10 years ago, I guess, in part just on that. You know, what were the main points of his first campaign? Immigration.
I remember
was,
talking to him
immigration
about
was
it in
one,
his office in
and
Trump
trade
Tower
was
that
another
day.
one.
When
Yeah.
he came down the escalator, I was up in his office that day.
And made some progress in his first term, made even more progress over the last year. And you're right that after Liberation Day, which gave most people in Washington the vapors, you saw 9-10 months of fairly successful trade deals being brought to a close. And even with the Supreme Court's decision, wrong in my view as I read the law, that a lot of those tariffs were unlawful, most nations still said that they're going to honor those trade agreements and move forward with them. And I think what the president is trying to do bit by bit by bit is to get better terms for America's businesses and workers and farmers and create a stronger bilateral bond with countries that for the most part would rather be close partners with the United States than with communist China. Very few countries around the world would freely choose to be an economic vassal state of communist China. So the more of these agreements that we can conclude and cement closer ties, it often leads to closer security ties as well, the stronger it leaves us relative to China.
Yeah, so by the way, one of the things we keep talking about, which is a really, really important thing, and I think you will agree with me on this as well, is, and by the way, I got to give a special shout. We have friends from both Greece and Taiwan here in the audience. I remember I interviewed the Greek Prime Minister right after Liberation Day last year, and he was the first world leader to defend President Trump. And in his interview with me, and he said, hey, "Guys, everybody needs to chill out. This is going to be okay. We're going to get to a great trade deal." And lo and behold, a few months later, that's where we ended up. He was exactly right, and I think you know. But the reason why I think about that is that because one of the things that the Greeks have done, and I was just at an event last night at the Greek embassy here to the United States, and Ambassador Guilfoyle was there, and the Greek ambassador to the U.S. It's for their Greek Independence Day. Is that they have really leaned in on the energy, right? Like, energy is a big part of this, right? We're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about any of these other places. It's all about energy. Energy is real world power. Can you talk to us about how important energy is to this national strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. It is vital. It is a core not just of national security, but of prosperity as well. You know, when there's a storm and the lights go out at your house, you don't say the electricity is off. You don't say the energy went out. You say what? The power went off. It literally is what powers a modern society. And you can find this expressed in various ways on the internet, simple graphs of time versus, however you want to put it, quality of life, standard of living, GDP per capita. And for most of human history, the line goes all the way just right along the bottom at 0. And then about 250, 300 years ago, it shoots up. And that's when mankind developed the technological ability to get energy from sources other than our muscles or animal muscles or wind or water. First with coal, and then with oil and gas, and then with nuclear. It is the thing that powers everything in our lives. It powers our buildings
are on
and
in
businesses,
here,
it powers our homes, it powers our cars, our airplanes, our military. You can't do without it. Now, we're very blessed in America to have abundant energy. We could have more if it wasn't for liberals being hostile, not just to energy, but to capitalism and Western civilization, and trying to suppress it for that reason, because they'd all like us to live back in the Stone Ages, as long as they have total control over it. China does not have nearly as much energy, and they've got to import more than we have to import. And one thing we want to make sure that they do, same thing with their food supply, they don't have enough food either, that we're not kind of gifting it to them by allowing countries like Venezuela or Iran to just freely trade in violation of sanctions.
So, okay, so now when we're talking about all these things elsewhere around the world, it really feels like we are, again, the president has really turned a corner here. We haven't had an American president, except for in his first term, that really has done as much around the world to really, it feels like we were just, playing defense for a long time against Belt and Road Initiative and other efforts by the Chinese, et cetera. We're on offense now. But one of the big concerns, I think, and this is one of the big focuses of this event that we're doing here, we just had several other panels and a discussion, like I said, with your colleague, Senator Banks, is that, we got to watch the back door here at home, right? There's a lot of threats to some of the stuff that's happening here. We were talking a lot about this whole FDA green list of, so this is like totally mind-bogglingly new to me. I've learned about it in the last few weeks as we've been preparing for this event. Apparently, we're allowing Chinese companies to make knockoffs compounds of American drugs and then with cheap, weird ingredients that they're unclear about and then push them into the country, and they don't even tell anybody what's in them. And the FDA is greenlisting this, apparently. What is happening with this?
Yeah, well, we shouldn't be doing that. To take a step back, unfortunately, again, China using illegitimate means has a lot of the pharmaceutical market cornered. Many of our, not super high-end, cutting-edge drugs, but just very basic medicines like ibuprofen and acetaminophen, penicillin, heparin. China has cornered the market on that over the decades, and that's a dangerous place to be. We take it for granted. You can just go to Walmart and pick up a bottle of ibuprofen if you want, but if China cut us off, that's a big problem. Or if your kid's got an ear infection and you can't get antibiotics because China's cut us off, that's a big problem. This specific one is very worrisome as well because, again, you're not talking about mass-produced, well, not on the scale of something like ibuprofen or acetaminophen, but compounded drugs. And understandably, if you or a loved one has some illness and you can get a compounded drug that's much cheaper and you don't even realize it's got adulterated Chinese components in it, you're going to do that to treat your illness or to treat your loved one's illness. And there's, unfortunately, several cases of people falling ill or even dying from these compounded drugs. So I think we need to draw a very firm line that we can't accept these kind of adulterated Chinese compounded drugs into our country.
Right. So now you mentioned something there too that's like a terrifying thought. Let's say we get into tensions rise between us economically, or perhaps even, God forbid, we end up at war or something with China. But who's to stop them from saying no more Tylenol, no more acetaminophen, no more ibuprofen, no more antibiotics?
Nothing, and they've done it before. In 2010, I think it was, they threatened to cut Japan off from rare earth elements that Japan needs just as much as we do in their advanced manufacturing over a dispute of some islands between Japan and China. In 2020, at the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when President Trump and I were pointing out that China had unleashed this plague on the world, a communist apparatchik threatened to withhold not just drugs, but basic medical supplies as well, latex gloves, masks, face shields for doctors, that kind of thing. So China would absolutely do that. They've made it clear by their actions and their words they would do so. I'm not saying that we need to make every pill of Tylenol or ibuprofen that America consumes here in the United States, but we at least probably need to have some of that capability, and we probably need to have some degree of reserve, or we need to get a lot more from friendly nations. I haven't looked at it recently, but the last time I looked at it, there are plenty of advanced industrial democracies that make these drugs, places like Japan or Denmark or Italy. And if they can make it at a reasonable cost, then we can probably make at least some of it at a reasonable cost too.
So how do we do that? What are the steps that we're,
Well,
you
a
guys take?
lot of it is
Yeah.
needless red tape. We shouldn't be greenlighting Chinese drugs while we're drowning American pharmaceutical and biotech companies in red tape and making it harder for them to build new manufacturing facilities, move more quickly through clinical trials, get more drugs onto the market. Some of it would have to be through the purchasing power of the U.S. government as well. Between Medicare, Medicaid, Department of Defense, the VA, that's a lot of healthcare purchasing power. And I don't think we should be using U.S. tax dollars to underwrite Chinese drug companies when they could underwrite American drug companies, again, at a fairly reasonable cost.
So now there's several other
And
things.
that I should just add, that creates the demand for, like, if you're a generics manufacturer and you can make it cheaper in China or any other country, well, you might do that there. But if there's a demand coming from the United States government for these generics to be made inside the United States, or even in a place like Puerto Rico, which used to produce a lot of drugs, or Guam or some other American territory, then you can take to your investors or to your board and say, like, look, it's a reasonable expenditure of our capital to build a factory in the United States or to build a factory in Puerto Rico to meet this demand that the U.S. government has now created for us.
So now, one of the things that I've learned too, as I've been preparing for this and doing my homework and studying, is that there is a lot, China has just in the last few years significantly increased the percentage of new drugs that are being developed and whatnot. And so I think it went from like something like, around 10% in 2018 or 19 to something like close to 30% now.
Yeah.
That's pretty close to us. Like
It is, regrettably. Yeah. So this is on the higher end of the pharmaceutical chain. Producing generics of things like ibuprofen or acetaminophen is on the lower end. But unfortunately, China has moved pretty far down the chain of, say, biologics and doing clinical trial work, almost getting to the global share that we have. And again, this gets back to bureaucratic inertia and red tape. It's just very hard to bring a drug to market in the United States. I mean, the Democratic Party wants to make it impossible to bring a drug to market, but they also want drugs to cost less, right, which doesn't really work in basic economics. So this is a case where regulatory policy really does have serious national security effects.
So, but on that note too, with the clinical trials, from what I understand too, China, when they do clinical trials in China, they can just order anybody. They have all sorts of unwilling participants, right? Like
a lot easier when you can tell
to,
people what drugs they're going to take.
Yeah, that's the beauties of living in a communist dictatorship,
yeah,
right? Like, so it's there's not like freedom where you can like opt out of a trial or something like that. They're just ordering it on people. But the another thing about China too that's really fascinating, and I think that it's important for people to understand this, is that there's no such thing as a private company in China, right? Like, I mean, they literally all report to one person. They're dictators, Xi Jinping, right? Like, can you explain that for us? Because I think that and how that affects this stuff.
There's no such thing as a private sphere in China. I mean, just consider that for decades, China has a one-child policy. It doesn't get much more intrusive than that. The government intervening, with a married couple to tell them how many children they can have. I mean, this is something straight out of like Plato's Republic, which, as a reminder, was an ironic statement that Socrates had said you had to construct to have the so-called perfectly just city, which means you can't have perfect justice here in this world. But in China, like in many communist dictatorships, they'll reach into the deepest and most private parts of human life. So, of course, if they don't allow a man and wife to make the decision between themselves how many children they're going to have, they're going to allow private companies to make any decision. You see this most commonly in companies that have national security implications. Either they make, they're part of the defense industry in China or dual-use materials, increasingly cutting-edge tech companies whose algorithms are an important part of national security today, but also, of course, in pharmaceutical companies or any other company. I mean, you can make money and grow your business, but in the end, you dance to the Chinese Communist Party's tune. And if they tell you you're going to do this, you're going to do that, that's what you're going to do. Otherwise, you're not going to have your company anymore. And if you stick your head up, like Jack Ma once did, it's probably going to get chopped off, or at least you're going to be disappeared for a long time, the way Jack Ma was.
So another thing that they use as a tool from the CCP to again build their influence and to, target the West is intellectual property theft. We see them targeting American companies. We see them targeting American researchers and universities. It seems like every time I turn around, there's another, professor or something, at some major American university or institution that's arrested after being caught trying to smuggle things into China, information or something, research or whatever. Can you talk to us a little bit about the intellectual property?
Again, it's pervasive. The
theft?
FBI said over multiple directors they have many open cases in every single one of their field offices, to include in places like Arkansas. Chinese nationals are under indictment for stealing advanced rice genome technology. There's a professor at the University of Arkansas that was charged for being complicit with China. Most of these cases, they're witting and they understand what they're doing. Oftentimes, I think it's a product of a kind of naive academic mindset of like open science. Fortunately, it happens at our national labs as well. You'd be shocked at thousands of Chinese and Russian nationals that are running around the Department of Energy's national labs in the name of open science. Last I checked, we haven't been sending any of our scientists into China's equivalent of national labs. But again, it's because there's not really a security mindset at places like our labs or the National Science Foundation or most universities. They're full of PhDs that do a lot of great work in their areas of specialty. They could probably use someone, a veteran of the FBI or CIA, to help open their eyes to the threat of Chinese espionage in their work and around them.
So where I want to kind of go in the last few minutes we got left here, Senator, is that it does feel like we've been making strides and improvements, at least the last few years, at least certainly in terms of making the public aware of many of these threats, right? I think that the broader American public is much more aware of the threat of the Chinese Communist Party now than they've ever been. And we're certainly seeing some positive action, I think, from the administration, from you guys in the Senate. What are some of the bigger steps moving forward that we have to do to really take this to the next level and, again, protect our American industries, whether it's the biotech industry, what we're talking about here today, or more broadly anything, right, like any of our industries, and also continue to challenge them on the world stage?
Yeah, well, Matt, it's a lot of what we've been talking about already, getting more manufacturing capacity back to the United States. Again, we don't have to meet our entire needs, but we need at least some basic level of manufacturing, especially of critical supplies, whether they're fairly basic things like acetaminophen or very high-end things like semiconductors. I hope the President has a successful summit with Xi in 7 weeks that, again, addresses a lot of China's predations against the United States and really against the entire civilized world. I think there's legislation pending in Congress. There may have been votes on it in committee today over in the House that would address the threat of China getting advanced artificial intelligence driving chips and making sure that they're not getting the highest end of them, making sure that we can locate them so they're not being smuggled from third parties, from third countries that can't have them and into China, making sure that American demand is met before we're starting to send those vital product overseas. So whether it's the regulatory action, the President's Summit, upcoming potential legislation in Congress, I think there's a lot of steps that remain to be taken. You're right, though, we made big strides over the last 10 years. In some ways, the measure of the success of a foreign policy is whether it lasts beyond one administration. And that's certainly the case with America's turn on China going back 10 years since President Trump's election, very much to his credit. I've seen it change inside the Senate from when I got there a couple of years before President Trump arrived, that people are much more open-eyed about the threat from China as opposed to in 2015. They still had the
I
kind of...
won't name any names, but I know some of your Democrat colleagues who I've talked to personally they're very awake about this. Like, they understand the threat. So we disagree with them on everything else, but on this, they're
in some ways, especially if they came from more of the kind of the lunch bucket union tradition in the Democratic Party, not like the lunatic college professor wing of the Democratic Party. They were more alive to it because trade unions were very alive to this threat going back decades because they saw the possibility that China could use cut-rate labor, in many cases slave labor, to take their jobs away from them. And that's what happened after China became, or got permanent most favored nation status and entered the WTO, first one under Bill Clinton, second one under George Bush. That's when you had the real China shock. We lost some of our prosperity to China in the 1990s, but it was only with permanent most favored nation status and WTO entry that corporate leaders could say, okay, I don't have to worry about Congress year after year voting to revoke this status. Now I can not just open up a small office in China, I can pick entire factories up and put them in China, confident that that investment will be safe. We've never gone down that road, in my opinion, and that brought us to a lot of where we are. But in 2015, I can say you still had a lot of senators who viewed the world in that way. It's very, very much less the case now. And although the Biden administration tried to quietly walk back or unwind some of Trump's China policies, they didn't do that in a public fashion. They didn't beat their chest about it. Again, some things eroded. Sanctions regimes have to be updated as the targets of sanctions, change their corporate form and move assets around and so on and so forth. But Joe Biden and his administration clearly understood that the American people have no patience for communist China or for politicians who want to carry water for them anymore. In contrast to, say, Joe Biden's Iran policy, in which he explicitly and publicly and proudly repudiated what Donald Trump had done. He did not do that on China policy, and that's a real testament to how far President Trump has moved domestic viewpoints on China. And actually, I'd probably say elite viewpoints on China, because most normal Americans probably shared his view on China. That's why he got elected in the first place. It's moving opinion in places like the Congress, like corporate America, like American media, like American businesses, and so on.
I would say even around the world too, right? Like, I mean, again, I've done 6 different world leader interviews in the last year. We're in talks with a number of other places. I mentioned the Prime Minister of Greece. I talked to the President of Cyprus. I've spoken to the Prime Minister of Qatar. I mean, one of the things he said to me was they're very much with us and not with China.
Yeah, and that's an example of American leadership in the world. A lot of countries, again, almost no country wants to be a vassal state of China, and most of them know that that's China's basic intent. But when you had successive American administrations going back decades saying, oh, China's rising, it's going to be peaceful, we need to help it and encourage it, they're not going to raise their hand and say, like, they're trying to stick me with a multi-billion-dollar bill for something I don't want. So once you had an American president like Donald Trump in his first term step out and say these things about China, it became very politically safe for leaders around the world whose domestic constituencies had the same grievances that Americans have against China to voice those same concerns.
So, Senator, just kind of one of the last thing I want to wrap up on here is I know you've got a number of pieces of legislation focused on a lot of these things. I know I was talking to your staff earlier today. They were telling me about how you have a bill going after Chinese vapes. You've got all sorts of other pieces of legislation that you've been laying out. Can you kind of give us what you've been doing from your Senate office, from the Senate Republican Conference Chair position to help move this conversation forward?
A lot of this legislation focuses on the Pentagon and our military more broadly, in part because the Armed Services Committee still passes a piece of legislation every year, so you can legislate for the Department of Defense. So like the vapes example, it's not just the vapes can be adulterated and make you sick if they're from China, but they actually contain electronic circuitry in there. So it's a counterintelligence threat to have privates running around with Chinese vapes that basically are like a Bluetooth device that could illicitly connect to your phone or your wearable fitness tracker, or something worse if you have it around the base. So that's just one example of it. Or using the purchasing power of the Pentagon to try to, again, incentivize more domestic manufacturing of basic pharmaceutical ingredients here. Using that purchasing power to try to map out the supply chain for the industry as a whole, because if you map it out for the department and for TRICARE, you map it out for any healthcare purchaser in America. And we've made a lot of success there. And as you said, I mean, this is one of the rare areas these days where you can get some bipartisan cooperation.
Yeah, I'm hoping that there will be more and more of that as we move forward. Senator Tom Cotton, really want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah.
I know you guys are busy in there
Thank you,
in
man.
the Senate. Hopefully we can get the Department of Homeland Security reopened soon.
I hope so as well.
Yeah.
Thank you
All
all.
right, thank you.